So our third panel, and this is not a last but least, these are all such strong panels. So our third group today is going to be moderated by Melissa Goldberg, Director of Competencies and Credentials at the Corporation for a Skilled Workforce, on competencies, skills, and learning outcomes.
Thank you, Holly. Oh my gosh, what amazing conversations we've had so far. And I'm really excited about this panel that we're about to have. So we're turning now to a conversation about the terms competency, skills, and learning outcomes. What do they mean? How do we use them? And why does it matter? And so I'm thrilled to be joined by an all-star team of panelists to help us unpack this. And they are Naomi Boyer, Executive Director, Digital Transformation at the Education Design Lab, Sarah DeMark, Vice President of Program Development at Western Governors University and Executive Director of the Open Skills Network, Amber Garrison Duncan, Executive VP of the Competency-Based Education Network, or CBEN, and Nan Travers, Director of the Center for Leadership and Credentialing and Learning at SUNY Empire State College and the co-lead of Credential as You Go, who's hosting us today. And so let's jump in. Competency, skills, learning outcomes, they're all terms that mean different things, but they're often used interchangeably. So Naomi, I'm wondering if you can reflect on the implications of this in your work with colleges and employers. Where do you go to find the definitions?
Thank you so much, Melissa. Let me say competency, skills, and learning outcomes. Oh my, right? It's a crazy environment. And thank you to all the other panelists, because your energy is just, it is inspiring. Where do I go? Great question. I'm often writing pieces or preparing some documentation, and I want to just quick definition of what is a digital micro-credential or what is a skill. And guess what, folks? There are tons and tons of definitions out there. The meanings are not always the same. In our organizations, we're looking at competencies described differently than skills, described differently than sub-competencies, right? It's a complicated network that we've woven together, which then makes it very difficult for all of us to communicate together. And do I think that we're all going to agree within our organizations on these things? No. It's okay that we have our own definitions, but at some point, we have to agree that when we're having this dialogue, here's what we mean, right? Because I could use the word competencies to talk about knowledge, skills, and abilities, but what do we hear when we're talking about how we want to connect those things? Open skills network, right? It's skills, or the skills economy, or the skills ecosystem. But we know oftentimes when we use that, we're really talking about something that's a little bit bigger, which are those competencies, right? So there's the terminology that's out there. We kind of, thank you so much. When we began, we started talking about micro-credentialing and badging, right, Julie? And how all of that comes together and what that looks like. And so a lot of these terms, in some cases, we're using synonymously. When we unpack them, they're not the same thing. But we need to make sure we contextualize our conversations around, here's what I mean when I use the word. Another good example is framework. I've worked on competency frameworks, and I'm betting when I use the word framework, each and every one of you has your own mental model of what that means, and it's not all the same. So leveling out and having some place that's valuable for us all to go and say, at least in this particular conversation, this is how I contextualize my comments. It'll help us all at least come at it from the same vantage point.
Great, thank you, Naomi. Yes, it's so important. As you're saying, these terms are meaning different things to different people, and really having that context when you're entering the conversation, so you're bringing all the folks together. You talked about skills and the Open Skills Network, so I'd like to turn this over to Sarah and just get your perspective on this with the work you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. So some of the work that we've been doing, starting at Western Governors University around skills, was really trying to make sure that our degree programs or any credential that we offer is aligned to the skills that are in demand by employers and meet workforce demand needs. And so in doing this work, we've said, okay, great, let's go look at the skills that employers are looking for. And so we did a lot of work with the third-party labor market insight providers like MC and Burning Glass, and we came back with this list of skills, and we said, well, these are really high level. Like, what does communication mean? If you think about even a technology professional, are we talking about communicating technical concepts to technical peers? Are we talking about taking technical concepts and explaining that to non-technical peers? Like, what does that actually mean? And so what we really started to realize was that, like, these are big, broad concepts when you typically think about skills. And to really make them meaningful and impactful, we need to dive a little bit deeper and put some context behind those. And so that was a lot of the work then. So WGU started in this work, and it was like, wow, like if we could get everybody, you know, kind of speaking the same syntax when we talk about skills, like then we're really going to be able to start to connect the dots between all of these skills-based education and hiring systems within the larger construct. So how do we start to kind of pull that together? And so really the work of the Open Skills Network is to create that open standard for how we communicate skills. And what that means is that contextualized skills statement that can then be tagged to all the different, to use Naomi's word, frameworks and, you know, licensure and accreditation requirements, whatever it is that's out there, then we can start to tag these components together. So really, it becomes a really powerful kind of piece that actually has context and meaning and can be leveraged. And so some of the work that we've done on WGU's side is to kind of separate out even, it's kind of like, what does a credential mean? What does a skill mean? And so we're really starting to kind of even piece that out further by saying, you know, the skills that we typically see in reports, like communication and data analysis and so forth, we're calling those market signal skills, right? That's just a skill that these are, or a signal that these are skills that the market is looking for. But that's not really what we need to be able to make it meaningful. And so that's when we're really starting to use these rich skills descriptors, which are part of that open skills standard for OSN, to really specify that out. And from there, we sort of build competencies on top of it. We view those rich skills descriptors as being that atomic unit of value, of which then competencies sit on top of. So we see that either as a one-to-one match, or it could be a one-to-many match, but really starting to kind of create those linkages from employers through the language of skills and back up to competencies. And then from there, kind of showing how those weave into credentials or achievements of value or so forth. So that's kind of where all of this work has come from the Open Skills Network. It's free to join. Anybody can join if you guys want to, you know, sort of learn what we're doing here. But really, it's trying to create an open standard around this missing piece within that whole skills-based hiring and education ecosystem.
Well, that's great, Sarah, and really diving in deeply, providing that context and creating that transparency from what you're hearing from the employers into these competency frameworks and other. And I'm hearing a theme about context and understanding these terms within the context of what it is that you're doing. So Amber, through the work you're doing with CBRN, jump in and tell us how you see this.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. And I'm so honored to be here with Naomi and Sarah and Nan, some amazing women who are, we talked about who's running the competency world, girls. But I am most excited because, again, we hear what's coming together here is that constant theme of skills to competencies to and context across both of those being important. And as we were doing our prep call yesterday, you know, I was sharing that the work we do in the Competency-Based Education Network is to help institutions understand how to take that market signal, exactly what WGU is doing, right? How do I take what this employer is telling me they need someone to know and be able to do, and turn that into a curriculum that's designed and flexible enough to serve today's learners, to provide a more equitable outcome, and ensuring that every learner in the program reaches mastery and is going to have success after graduation from their credential program. And that translation piece is important. So I shared an example of last week, we were with a group of institutions from Texas who had taken a national restaurant Association Foundation competency framework. Back to this conversation of frameworks, because we ask people to externally reference, an industry work or an employer work. And in there, you could see this confusion start to emerge between that's actually a skills statement. Here's an actual competency statement. And so I think in practice, we start to see, again, all this really merging and coming together. But again, because that is such an important distinguishing moment, we have to really piece this apart and help institutions understand what is that skill signal? How do I translate that into a competency? How do I design the appropriate curriculum to deliver on that? And then how do I assess that in a contextual way? Really pushing on all of our institutions to think about applied assessment that, again, incorporates that context, because that's what employers are looking for at the end of the day too, is not just do you know something and can you do something, but can you do it in the way that I'm going to need you to do this on this job? And so that requires a deep connection in with employers. And Jonathan, you mentioned this, like that's a new way of operating and being for institutions. And Sarah, is this a skill or a competency? I think that could be its whole game show, and actually it would be really hard. So that's the work we're seeing at CEBA, and how this is playing out in institutions, again, when they're trying to meet employers and where they're at, provide a more equitable academic model. This is a challenge. This is confusing to them, and having some clarity around what these different things mean. When I use skills versus competencies, and then we've got learning outcomes, we've got to get to the accreditor, right? It's very confusing. And I think earlier I called it chaos, is what it feels like when we sit down with faculty who are trying to make sense of this.
You brought me right where I wanted to go, Amber. Again, this through theme of context is coming through, from employers to competency frameworks to institutions and accreditors. And Nan, you do so much work on the faculty side, which is where Amber started to go. Talk about this from that perspective as well.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm actually absolutely amazed with everything that's been said today. So my mind is spinning very quickly. And I want to come back to sort of the reason, in many ways, learning outcomes came about. It's been more than 20 years when we started to have that big push. And it really was about transparency in terms of, when you have a class, it's not just up to a single professor to be able to do whatever is happening in that classroom, but there actually is some transparency about it. And there's a way of saying that certain kinds of knowledges are that we know what's going to happen there. And at the same time, when we really talk about the skills movement and the competencies movement, a lot of it is about transparency also. But what happens and has been happening is that somehow they are equated as being different or of different value. So I've been playing with an idea of being able to say, okay, what if a skill was worth a penny, and then it takes 25 pennies and then you get a competency, and it takes 4 competencies and you get a learning outcome. And immediately people are saying, but a penny is worth so much less. And I'm saying, but isn't 100 pennies equal to $1? And so we get into this idea that something is less than something else by our language, and that the language itself is creating a power differential here. And I want to come back to, Donahue mentioned about the power dynamic here. And this is something that we really have to be careful about our language, because there is something that is elitist about a learning outcome. Like, you're going to have this grand knowledge here, and as soon as you start breaking it into competencies or skills, that somehow that's work, and that's not what we, that doesn't belong together. And yet, when we talk about what people know and can do, and we talk about being able to integrate the learning from, regardless the environment, that the source isn't what matters, it matters what people know and can do. We have got to work on this language, because we are creating a differential by our language. We are creating inequities in the way that we're talking about it. And so one of the things we really have to be thinking about is, as we work further and further along in terms of thinking about how to credential learning, that we think about that we don't build language around source, that we don't build language around people. We build language about knowledge, what people can do, what people know, and that we talk about ways of bringing those two things together. So as we work with faculty quite a bit around evaluating workplace learning and looking at how to integrate that into academic programming, we really have to have these conversations about, when people talk about what is college level, like somehow we have to stop thinking about it in terms of this big differential, but really getting at what is it that it's really about, and starting to equalize that in order to be able to recognize more of what people know and making sure they have the credentials so that they do get the employment.
It's so important what people can do with what they know, how they articulate it, how it's assessed, and how it's recognized so that they are credentials and receive credentials of value. Hugely important. I want to just, we only have like 2 minutes left. I want to do a quick lightning round. Given the differences in the ways that you and your partners use these terms, how should we talk about this? How should we talk about skills, learning outcomes, competencies, and in a compelling and clearly understandable way? I'm going to start with you, Nan.
Sarah just also put into the chat, bringing up the transparency. I think the transparency is key here, that we can't create hidden agendas behind our language and the way that we're talking about skills, competencies, and learning outcomes. The language actually doesn't matter. What really matters is that we are being explicit about it. We are being transparent, and that it's reachable for everybody.
Great. Amber.
I think in that explicitness, we also need to think critically about who we're including to help us make these definitions, and how we are including communities that have traditionally not been included in the conversation to help us land in the right place. That way it is transparent to everyone that it should be transparent to, and it is received by everyone it should be received by.
Great. Sarah.
Yeah, I think what has been said is spot on. I think the other piece, I think to just add a little bit to what Amber said, is bringing in that employer voice, right? Because I think if we start to talk about skills in a way that really makes that translation layer between education providers and employers, it helps students, right? Students don't understand the skills that they have. They don't understand their value. They don't understand how to talk about them. So even as we're trying to, create some sort of standardization, in this chaos, I think transparency is key, but it's got to be able to connect the dots for that individual to be able to make good decisions about what education they want to pursue and to be able to communicate that value to employers.
Great. And Naomi, final thoughts?
That leaves me to wrap it up, and I'm going to take it a little bit because I agree with everything everyone else was saying, and you're finding in the chat people are putting in other people that need to be engaged in the dialogue about this transparency and intentionality with how we define these terms. But I'm also going to throw out there, and based upon what we heard from our previous panelists to say, data is hard. Establishing the outcomes and understanding of whether we are truly meeting our goals, this is not easy work, particularly because many of these credentials are alternative in nature. Whether we're talking, and alternative meaning sometimes they're offered on the non-credit side and through alternative means, which then means we usually don't have the learner data to follow them towards impact and outcomes. And we have to start thinking differently about how we measure those outcomes. So to Sarah's points on rich skill descriptors and defining what a skill, what is the information we need to know about a skill, we need to figure out as a community, what is important to know about these alternative credentials.
Yep. Thank you. I think we could spend 2 more hours talking about this, but I'm afraid our time is up. So Holly, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Oh, thank you so much. And such a great panel. The whole afternoon has been just fabulous. Again, wish we had more time.